So a couple of weeks ago, Debbie and I saw the movie Church People, which is a satire and a comedy. We laughed all the way through it. It's light, it's amusing. It actually pokes fun at the church in some ways, while also pointing to the deeper message of the gospel. I'm really happy to have Thor Ramsey. He's an actor, he's a writer, he's a comedian, he's been in a bunch of movies. He's one of the stars of Church People. Thor, may I call you that?
You may call me Thor, absolutely. Absolutely.
Hey, welcome to the podcast. Tell people what this movie is. What's the basic plot of the movie? You play a guy. Well, your name is also Guy.
Yes.
And you get caught up in a very interesting situation. What is that?
Yeah. So basically the premise of this movie, to make a long story short, back in about 2010, I was working on the script and a friend called me up, church planter. He says, "You're not going to believe this, what this church is doing on Good Friday." He says, "They're actually crucifying a human being." I'm like, "There's no way." He goes, "Yeah, I'm looking at their social media right now." So I'm like, I check it out. And it turned out to be not the case, but they were doing a passion play, but it was going to be so graphic that they had so many warnings about blood and fainting and stuff that he interpreted it as they were actually going to crucify someone. But I realized at that point that American evangelical pastors, probably for the best of intentions, had done such crazy things to attract people to church that for a second, my friend and I believed that an American evangelical church would actually crucify someone on a Good Friday. And right then I knew I had a big idea for my screenplay that I was working on. And that kind of became the central idea. And that's what we really, in terms of the satire, that's what we satirize, is this idea that we have to put whistles and bells on the gospel to make it interesting, when the reality is we don't. The gospel is the power of God, doesn't need any help from us.
I mean, in a sense, I guess what you have is you've got these churches, and some of them are mega churches, and they feel that they are in a competitive market and they have to attract people into the pew and keep them there. And so as a consequence, presumably these gimmicks are sort of market-driven techniques in which entertainment sort of substitutes for the true meaning of the gospel, right?
Yeah. There's actually a couple serious books that helped inform the theme of the screenplay. David F. Wells, who wrote a book called The Courage to be Protestant. And that's a serious book. But in that book, he has this, he writes about what you attract people with is what you have to keep them with. So if you attract them with a show, then you have to keep up that, if you're giving something away, it has to get bigger and bigger. If you're giving away a flat screen, the next week or the next year, it has to be a car, and just has to get your gimmicks, so to speak, have to keep getting bigger and bigger, or you lose your audience. And statistics show that the average evangelical switches churches every 7 years. And I think part of that is, and I'm not against big churches, that's not the idea. It has to do with our methodology. And that's really what the film is getting at.
I think one thing that's kind of cool is that, sometimes in the Christian world, there's the stereotype that Christians are really somber and they don't have the ability to chuckle at themselves. And I think what's cool about this movie is that it kind of turns the camera around. It looks inwardly at the church, and it's willing to say, hey, listen, there's something slight comic stuff going on here too, and we Christians can laugh at ourselves.
Well, you hope so, because that would be a sign of humility. The opposite would not be humility. And I think humility lends itself to not taking yourself so seriously, or at least when someone points out a flaw in yourself, instead of rising up in defense of yourself, you go with it. And I think the comedians we all love the most are those comedians who are, they are able to poke fun at themselves. So I would hope the church could, because again, it's not, here's what I tell people. It's like, you can only satirize what you love. I love Jesus. I love the church. So the movie doesn't come across as mean, but whenever you see a satire from someone who doesn't love their subject, it comes across as mean. And I could point out several satirical military movies made over the last 5 years where you can tell these people they don't love the military, and I'm not sure they love this country. So those satires come across as mean-spirited, whereas when you love your subject, it doesn't.
I mean, it also seems like satire is very consistent with the Christian view of human nature, because, of course, the Christian view of human nature is that human nature is fallen. It's not perfect. It's not even really perfectible except through Christ. And so satire is a way of showing that even pastors, who are kind of the leaders of the flock, you might say, are susceptible to all kinds of weaknesses in which, in order to expand the audience. And one thing about the movie that's kind of interesting is that the pastor kind of has a good motive. He wants to bring more people in. He wants to it's not that he's just this corrupt guy who's sort of trying to sell out for money. He wants the church to do well, and so the things that he's doing come actually from a good place.
Yeah, because his character even has a redemptive moment in the script, but I think even as we see he's flawed, and his methodology and his motives aren't questioned. And I think that's an important thing, because that's really what we're saying even to the church. Again, it's not that we're against big churches making the film. There are a lot of big churches that do great things, but I think one of the things it hits on, a thing that's close to me, is that, let's say there's 400,000 churches in America, upwards of that. And, being gracious, let's say only 200,000 of those believe the Bible. It's probably less than that, but just for the sake of math, which I'm not proficient at. But so only 1,000 of those are megachurches. But the megachurch mentality dominates the wider evangelical church, and all the small churches feel they have to compete. And I just feel like it's damaging overall to the methodology of the whole church, because you have small churches trying to do these same silly things to attract people. And that is not from my perspective, that's not a biblical view of church. And I think that's some of the issue we have now with some of these, great leaders in evangelicalism having their falls, is that we've adopted more of a CEO model of leadership rather than a servanthood model, which is the biblical model.
I mean, to me, one of the signs of a good movie is it makes you think a little beyond the movie. And as I was watching the film, I was thinking to myself, there are a lot of really good pastors who are very anchored in the gospel, but they're very reluctant to speak to the issues in our culture. They're a little bit shy about addressing the pro-life issue and some other issues. And I thought, I wonder if it's the same mentality. It's the idea that, listen, I cannot possibly give offense, even though this teaching comes right out of the gospel. I better not go there because I might lose some people in the pew. So when you start thinking of the church as a marketing operation, not only does it make you do gimmicks, which is what the movie satirizes, but it makes you kind of go silent on important moral issues.
Oh, man.
Which are related to the faith, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think there's a pandemic in the church of speaking the truth. I mean, I saw the stats the other day on how many pastors actually even address abortion, which you'd think would come up a lot, when you're doing sermons. And I think that's from my perspective, that's why the church is in the state she's in, is because we're afraid often to speak the truth, because we're afraid. It's almost like in order to reach people, we feel like we can't preach the truth because we feel like we'll push them away. So we feel like there's a little dance going on. I think it's just exactly the opposite. I mean, I used to be one of these people that would say, it's like, don't speak about politics from the pulpit because that's not the place for it. I'm like, well, if God is the author of all of life, and if he's sovereign over all things, then all things have a biblical point of view. And I think that's just I think it's a wrong-headed view to take. And I think we've actually shot ourselves in the foot with that kind of thinking.
Well, you've been part of a really good movie. It's called Church People. It's actually playing on the Salem platform, salemnow.com, and you can get a discount if you go to salemnow.com. Just put in the promo code Dinesh and watch the film. It's going to be a lot of fun for the whole family. Well, thank you, Thor Ramsey, for joining me on the podcast. We're going to leave you with a short clip from the film. Listen.
I told you if we broke attendance records, I'd get the church logo tattooed on my arm.
Skip, remember back when we first started? All we did was preach the gospel.
Ooh, Superman works. I like Superman. Guy, what do you think?
What happened to you?
Me? Your dad is the one with the gimmicks.
The power of the Holy Spirit propels us.
I just want the church to get back to the gospel.
Problem is you're trying to get your message across.
The gospel?
Right. And ain't nobody listening to that.